Okay, fine. So I'm talking to you on the camera, to you. Sometimes you're going to find answers you don't like. Well, that doesn't matter. It's simply irrelevant. And you might say, oh, we can't ask about X, Y, Y because we might be stigmatizing somebody who's X, Y, Y. Well, that's tough. I mean, that's just the way it is. If you don't like the answer, you never know the answer until you've asked the question. And you can't say, don't ask that question, because if you don't ask the question, you may be missing a whole important part of science. Well, XYY is a chromosome disorder. It's an extra chromosome. And there are plenty of those. Many people have seen kids with Down syndrome, which is an extra chromosome 21. Most of them are actually lethal or severely damaging. But the Y chromosome is slightly odd because it's very small, doesn't have much on it, apart from the instructions to make you male. So an XYY is sometimes called super male. It's an error, almost always a new error, that takes place usually during the formation of the father's sperm. I know exactly when it began. It began with a woman who I knew quite well, called Pat Jacob, in Edinburgh. I was a student in Edinburgh. And the mid-60s, 1965 actually, when I was in my third year at university. And it's worth remembering how new a field genetics is. In 1965, we had only just been able to begin looking at human chromosomes in any detail. The actual number had only been known for about 10 years or less. This lady, whose name was Pat Jacob, thought she'd found in a hospital for the criminally insane, Carstairs, near Edinburgh, an unusually high incidence, I think there were 3 cases, of XYY among people who committed really violent crimes compared to the population as a whole. And she published it as a piece of straightforward science, really rather preliminary science, given the small numbers. And I think she was shocked by the huge outpouring of controversy and political statements made on both left and right about this. And of course, in the end, what matters is the science. And Pat Jacob, I'm sure, would be happy to accept that finding 3 cases of a particular condition is not really very many. So that was a very preliminary finding. Are men with XYY more likely than men without XYY to get into trouble with the law? And the short answer is that the evidence is not conclusive. There's a small amount of evidence which is weak, there might be, but interestingly enough, they're not more likely to get into trouble with the law because of violent crimes, but because of antisocial behaviour and crimes in general. And it may well be that perhaps some of them have slightly lower IQ than normal. People with lower IQ often infringe against the law, and that's why they get into trouble. But the idea that all men with XYY become criminals, let alone dangerous criminals, is absurd.
Aggression still has a very important part in Kendo, but it's learning how to turn it on and turn it off and use it to your advantage, but also to know when you can use someone else's aggression against them.
Certainly males who've got undue attacks of rage, and there are various reasons why that can happen, genetic and non-genetic. So they can be treated by drugs, and many of them say that that's been a great help to them. They can also be treated, I'm told, by trying to vent their rage by taking karate lessons. And if it can treat the symptoms of rage by sending you to a karate class, why not? Most people, if they're starving, will steal. Most people, if they're pushed into a corner by a ravening mob, will kill. But most of the time we're not starving and we're not pushed into a corner by a ravening mob. So we behave in perfectly civilized fashion. Maybe people with XYY, when they're pushed into a corner by a mob, are more likely to kill. But the answer to the problem is to stop mobs, not to stigmatize people with chromosomal abnormalities. It was a classic example of the abuse of genetic knowledge. People thought that this rare condition, XYY, with its weak effects, or possibly even non-existent effects on criminal behaviour, they put them together and said, oh, we can winkle out the criminals and we can either lock them up or we can treat them so kindly they'll never become criminals. And the short answer to that was a hopeless, completely hopeless prospect. I mean, now you can send your own DNA off, and for $500 they'll tell you whether you've got risk-taking genes. And men with risk-taking genes, it is said, are more likely to gamble, more likely to fall off cliffs, more likely to get into fights. In the end, the answer is don't gamble, don't fall off cliffs, and don't get into fights. And the genes, I think, are in the end irrelevant. So XYY should be a lesson for genetics, how not to do genetics, how not to use genetic information. But I fear it's like most genetic lessons, we'll have to learn it again and again.
Does that answer your question?